The world wasn't ready for this. What started as whispers in diplomatic circles has now erupted into full-blown panic in Washington, D.C., because Burkina Faso, under the leadership of Ibrahim Traoré, has just signed what many are calling the most defiant deal in modern African history. A deal with the BRICS alliance, a deal that could shift the global balance of power, and a deal that the United States never saw coming. For decades, Africa's natural wealth has flowed outward: gold, oil, uranium, and resources leaving the continent while poverty stayed behind. But now, one man has decided to rewrite that script, and that man is Ibrahim Traoré. In a historic meeting held behind closed doors in Ouagadougou, Traoré met with key BRICS envoys from Russia, China, and Brazil. Reports suggest the agenda was crystal clear: economic liberation, and a bold declaration that Burkina Faso would no longer bow to Western financial systems controlled by Washington and its allies. According to insiders, this agreement isn't just about trade or infrastructure. It's a full-spectrum partnership. BRICS will reportedly provide billions in direct investment to develop Burkina Faso's mining sector, renewable energy infrastructure, and digital payment systems, without any of the political conditions the IMF or World Bank typically attach. And that's exactly why Washington is furious. Because for the first time, Burkina Faso has chosen to align itself with a bloc that openly challenges the US-led global order. Across Africa, this move is being hailed as revolutionary. In Bamako, in Niamey, in Conakry, leaders are watching closely. Many of them have already severed military ties with France, but now, Traoré's bold pivot toward BRICS could mark the dawn of a new African economic independence. The announcement came quietly, no fanfare, no press conference, just a late-night statement from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Yet within hours, the news was trending across social media, with the hashtag #AfricaRises exploding in popularity. Western analysts are calling it a dangerous gamble. But in Ouagadougou, it's being celebrated as the moment Africa stood up for itself. And while the White House hasn't made an official statement, several unnamed officials have told Reuters and Al Jazeera that the U.S. is deeply concerned about Burkina Faso's increasing cooperation with Russia and China. But Traoré doesn't seem to care. In his televised address just hours after the deal was signed, he said, "We will no longer be slaves to those who once called us free. Freedom without control of our economy is not freedom. It is an illusion." Those words, powerful, unapologetic, are now echoing across the continent. From Johannesburg to Dakar, young Africans are flooding online forums with excitement. They see Traoré not just as a soldier or a president, but as a symbol of a new generation. A generation that refuses to let foreign powers dictate its future. But make no mistake, Washington will not let this go easily. Within hours of the BRICS deal being confirmed, reports surfaced that U.S. diplomats had reached out to several West African leaders urging them to reconsider their alignment. Economic warnings are already being whispered: sanctions, trade cuts, and reviewing aid packages. Yet in Ouagadougou, Traoré seems unfazed. His government has reportedly begun converting several key financial operations to BRICS-based digital payment systems, reducing dependency on the US dollar, a move that could have massive ripple effects across Africa. Because if Burkina Faso succeeds, others will follow. And that's the real reason for Washington's fear. This is no longer just about one small landlocked nation in West Africa. This is about the global power struggle, the silent war between the old order and the rising new one. BRICS, once seen as an economic forum, is now a weapon of diplomacy, and Traoré has just loaded it. Stay with us, because what's coming next could determine Africa's economic destiny for decades. The reaction from Washington was immediate and intense. Within just 48 hours of the BRICS deal announcement, the U.S. State Department held an emergency briefing. Behind closed doors, officials described Burkina Faso's move as a direct threat to U.S. influence in West Africa. But what exactly is Washington afraid of? Sources familiar with the situation say the panic isn't just about Burkina Faso. It's about what this deal represents. Because if Traore can successfully pivot a small, landlocked country toward economic sovereignty, then any African nation can do it, and the dominoes might already be starting to fall. Reports from Mali, Niger, and Guinea suggest that all three governments are now exploring similar talks with BRICS partners. Even Nigeria, the region's largest economy, is reportedly reviewing its dependency on the US dollar for energy and infrastructure contracts. This isn't just politics anymore. This is a full-scale shift of power, and Traore is right at the center of it. In Washington, think tanks are calling him the young leader who outplayed the West. But in Burkina Faso, he's being called something else, the defender of the people. According to leaked diplomatic cables obtained by an independent African news outlet, U.S. officials have been pressing neighboring countries to apply pressure on Burkina Faso. There are whispers of trade restrictions, suspended aid programs, and even discussions about military containment through ECOWAS partners. But Traore saw it coming. Weeks before the deal was even announced, he had already begun strengthening Burkina Faso's internal economy. Gold exports, once funneled through French channels, are now being redirected toward BRICS-friendly trade systems. Chinese engineers have already arrived in Ouagadougou to assist in the construction of new digital and mining infrastructure. And Russia, they've agreed to provide security and logistical support to protect these new projects from external interference. It's almost as if Traore anticipated every countermove before it happened. In one of his most defiant speeches to date, Traore declared, "They think Africa cannot survive without their aid. But we are not begging, we are building. Our wealth has been taken for centuries. Now we will use it to build our future." Those words sent shockwaves through diplomatic communities worldwide. For years, Africa was told that Western aid and investment were the only paths to progress. But now a new model is emerging, one built on equality, not dependency. BRICS is offering technology, industrial partnerships, and trade routes without political strings. To Washington, that's a nightmare, because if this model works, the Western system of aid for control collapses overnight. Let's look at what this new deal actually includes. According to leaked reports from the BRICS Economic Coordination Council, Burkina Faso will receive a $4.5 billion infrastructure package for roads, housing, and solar grids, a BRICS-backed currency facility for trade settlements independent of the US dollar, a 20-year partnership on gold, lithium, and rare earth mineral exports, shared profits, no exploitation, and perhaps most shocking, an agreement for military technology sharing to strengthen Burkina Faso's regional defense. That last part is what has Washington's defense circles trembling. Because for decades, the U.S. maintained influence in Africa by controlling military supply chains. But now that monopoly might be ending. Within the Pentagon, analysts have started referring to this as the new scramble for Africa. But this time, it's not Western powers carving up the continent. It's African nations reclaiming it for themselves. And right at the center stands Ibrahim Traore, calm, strategic, and unwavering. He's already stated publicly that he doesn't seek conflict, only independence. Yet he's fully aware that his decisions are painting a target on his back. Burkina Faso's intelligence agencies have reportedly detected increased surveillance activities around key government facilities. And in a chilling reminder of how high the stakes have become, several pro-Western opposition figures have suddenly started resurfacing online, calling for democracy restoration. But the people aren't buying it. Traore's approval ratings remain above 85%, and the streets of Ouagadougou are filled with murals and chants declaring, "Africa is awake." At this point, even Western media is struggling to maintain the old narrative. CNN recently aired a segment questioning U.S. policy in the Sahel. A BBC analyst admitted that the new wave of African nationalism might be unstoppable. And maybe that's the truth Washington doesn't want to face. Because what Traore has unleashed is no longer political, it's psychological. He's changed the way Africans see themselves, not as victims of global systems, but as architects of a new one. And the BRICS deal, it's just the first blueprint, but this story is far from over. Because even as BRICS expands its influence across Africa, Washington is preparing its next move, one that could push tensions in the Sahel to their breaking point. And once again, all eyes are on Traoré. The days following the BRICS deal were unlike anything Burkina Faso had ever witnessed. The streets of Ouagadougou pulsed with pride. Young men waved flags, women sang liberation songs, and the markets buzzed with a new kind of confidence. The kind that comes when a nation decides to write its own destiny. But while the people celebrated, the global elite were far from silent. In Washington, the tone shifted from diplomatic restraint to controlled panic. Meetings ran late into the night as officials debated how to handle what one senator reportedly called the most destabilizing event in African geopolitics since the end of colonialism. Inside the corridors of power, there was one name repeated more than any other: Ibrahim Traoré. The young captain had become the face of a movement the West couldn't predict, couldn't control, and couldn't stop. American intelligence reports painted a picture of a leader who was not only tactical but philosophical. Traoré wasn't just rejecting Western influence, he was dismantling the psychological foundation of it. His speeches, short but powerful, reached far beyond Burkina Faso. From Ghana to South Africa, from Kenya to Senegal, his message resonated. Africa will rise when we believe in ourselves, not when others believe for us. Washington, accustomed to African leaders who sought validation from the West, didn't know how to respond. For every diplomatic threat or warning issued, Traoré responded with calm defiance. He refused aid packages that came with hidden clauses, rejected military partnerships that demanded foreign bases, and instead strengthened alliances with nations that respected African sovereignty. At the same time, the U.S. quietly launched a campaign, not with armies but with information. Funded NGOs began releasing reports claiming Burkina Faso's democracy was in decline. Anonymous, human rights groups suddenly appeared online, accusing the government of censorship and repression. Western journalists began framing Traoré as a populist dictator. But this time, Africa didn't fall for the narrative. Social media exploded with videos and posts defending Traoré. Young Africans from across the continent began calling him the people's soldier. Hashtags like Africa for Africans and Stand with Traoré started trending globally. The West was losing not only influence but control over the story. For decades, Western media shaped Africa's image. Now Africans were doing it themselves. Meanwhile, inside Burkina Faso, the BRICS partnership was already bearing fruit. Chinese engineers set up new trade networks connecting rural areas directly to ports in West Africa. Russian advisors helped modernize national defense strategies. Indian investors pledged millions into renewable energy farms. And for the first time in the nation's history, Burkina Faso launched its own digital gold-backed payment system. It was a revolution, not of weapons but of ideas. The economy began to stabilize. Farmers who once relied on Western fertilizer subsidies now traded directly for technology and machinery from Brazil and South Africa. Small businesses flourished, local industries revived, and the youth, the backbone of the nation, began to believe again that they could build something lasting. But with progress came new dangers. Across the Atlantic, think tanks and intelligence agencies started drafting what they called containment strategies. Their goal was to prevent other African nations from following Traoré's path. Leaked documents suggested plans to intensify diplomatic pressure, manipulate trade routes, and if necessary, encourage regime change through regional partners. Burkina Faso's intelligence service caught wind of this and immediately went on high alert. According to insiders, Traoré ordered a full review of every foreign organization operating within the country. Those linked to foreign governments were quietly asked to leave. At the same time, the country's media channels began broadcasting documentaries and educational programs on African history. programs that reminded citizens how colonial systems had extracted their resources and rewritten their identity. It wasn't just governance. It was reprogramming an entire nation's mindset. In one of his late-night addresses to the youth, Traoré said, "They want you to forget who you are because when you forget, you obey. But a man who knows his history is already free, even before he wins the battle." The message hit deep. Across West Africa, students and activists began holding discussions about African self-reliance, inspired by Traoré's leadership. Universities invited economists from BRICS countries to talk about trade alternatives to the dollar. Slowly, the idea of a united, self-sufficient Africa stopped being a dream. It became a roadmap. But the more successful Traoré became, the more isolated he was from traditional Western allies. The U.S. suspended a key aid program, claiming policy misalignment. France withdrew its remaining financial cooperation, calling Burkina Faso's government non-democratic. The European Union issued a statement expressing deep concern over the direction of the Sahel region. Traoré responded with one sentence that would go viral across Africa: "You are not concerned about democracy. You are concerned about losing control." Those words burned through diplomatic walls like wildfire. It was the first time a leader in modern Africa had spoken so plainly, so fearlessly, and so publicly. But beneath the pride, tensions were building. Satellite images revealed increased U.S. military activity near Niger. Rumors spread of covert missions aimed at monitoring Burkina Faso's resource routes, and whispers began circulating that certain West African elites, long dependent on Western support, were being pushed to undermine Traoré's growing influence. It was a silent war fought not with guns, but with alliances, economies, and information. And yet Traoré didn't waver. He doubled down, urging his people to stand firm, to believe that no empire lasts forever. His rallies drew massive crowds, sometimes tens of thousands of people chanting, "We are the generation of freedom." The world was witnessing the birth of something it hadn't seen before: a united, confident, and unshakable African spirit. The West, despite all its might, couldn't contain it. But even as hope surged across the continent, those inside Traoré's inner circle knew one thing with certainty: the next phase of this struggle would not be easy. Because for every nation that stood with Burkina Faso, there was another still bound by Western promises, and those powers were not about to let Africa go quietly. The storm was coming, and in its center, one man stood ready: Traoré, the captain who had dared to defy the world. In the months that followed, the tremors of Burkina Faso's alliance with BRICS rippled across the world. What started as a regional power shift had now become a global awakening. From the streets of Bamako to the universities of Nairobi, one question echoed everywhere: if Traoré could do it, why can't we? Burkina Faso, once dismissed as a small, landlocked nation, had become the epicenter of Africa's new independence era. Western analysts had no clear explanation for it. Every report, every intelligence briefing, every economic forecast failed to predict how fast this movement was spreading. The West had assumed that Africa's loyalty could be bought, that leaders would always choose comfort over courage. But they hadn't accounted for a generation led by men like Ibrahim Traoré, men who valued dignity over dollars. And as the world watched, the U.S. began to lose more than just influence. It began to lose the narrative. Television anchors debated endlessly: how did Burkina Faso manage to resist? Why did sanctions not break them? What's the real power behind the BRICS alliance? Behind closed doors, frustration turned to fear. Washington sent envoys to neighboring countries, offering development packages and security cooperation. But many African leaders, emboldened by Traoré's stance, politely declined. Some even said openly, "We will not be pressured into alliances that serve others more than ourselves." It was a new Africa, an Africa that remembered, resisted, and rebuilt. Meanwhile, inside Burkina Faso, Traoré remained grounded. He continued to visit rural villages, sitting on the ground with farmers, listening to their struggles, reminding them that true leadership is service. In one such visit, a journalist asked him, "Mr. President, aren't you afraid? The most powerful nations are against you." Traoré smiled and replied, "A leader should only fear one thing, forgetting his people." That answer became a rallying cry across the continent. In South Africa, youth movements began organizing sovereignty marches. In Ghana, radio stations held debates titled the Traoré Doctrine. In Congo, soldiers painted "Africa will rise" on their barracks walls. The West called it nationalism. Africans called it rebirth. But not everyone celebrated. A new kind of battle began, an invisible one. Cyberattacks targeted Burkina Faso's government networks. False news stories emerged daily, claiming chaos and corruption. Anonymous sources fed Western outlets intelligence leaks about supposed power struggles inside Traoré's cabinet. It was psychological warfare, the kind designed to fracture a nation's confidence from within. But Burkina Faso had learned. The people no longer believed what came from foreign channels. They believed what they saw: progress, self-respect, and unity. And then came the turning point. During the annual BRICS summit, held that year in Johannesburg, the unexpected happened. The African delegation, led by Burkina Faso, proposed the formation of a Pan-African Economic Defense Fund, a financial mechanism to protect any African nation hit by Western sanctions. When Traoré stood to present it, the hall went silent. Cameras focused, translators paused. The young captain spoke with the clarity of a man who knew history was being written in that very moment. "For too long," he said, "we have begged for help, and in return we received chains. But today Africa will build its own foundation. If one of us falls, all of us will rise to lift them. No more puppets, no more begging. We are not children of aid, we are children of Africa." The hall erupted in applause. Delegates stood, clapping for nearly 3 minutes. Even foreign journalists trained to stay neutral couldn't help but write headlines that read, "Africa just drew its line in the sand." The U.S. response was immediate, quiet, but sharp. Financial restrictions were proposed, trade warnings issued, and diplomatic pressure mounted on countries still friendly to Burkina Faso. But the difference now was Africa didn't flinch. Nigeria offered to open its oil pipelines for new BRICS routes. Kenya pledged agricultural exports to the alliance. South Africa promised to lobby for more African seats in the BRICS Bank. It was happening. The continent was moving as one. And somewhere, deep within his office in Ouagadougou, Traoré looked over a map of Africa, not divided by colonial borders, but united by purpose. His advisors watched as he circled one word at the top of the map: unity. He then turned to them and said quietly, "We are not fighting against the world. We are fighting for our freedom in it." That night his speech was broadcast nationwide. Villages stopped their music to listen. Cities fell silent. The sound of his voice filled the airwaves. "Brothers and sisters, we stand at the doorway of history. They told us we were too small, too poor, too weak, but they forgot we are many. And together we are stronger than their fear. Let this be known, Burkina Faso will never kneel again." As his words echoed through radios and phones across the continent, Africans everywhere felt it, a spark of hope that no propaganda could extinguish. The next morning, murals appeared across African cities. They didn't depict a soldier or a politician. They showed an idea, an unbroken chain of hands stretching across the continent, painted with the words, "Africa United." The message was clear. The tide had turned. The world had changed. And the man who lit that fire, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the voice of a continent reclaiming its future. If you believe Africa deserves leaders who serve their people, not foreign interests. If you believe this story must reach every corner of the world, then don't just watch, be part of the movement. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and stay with us as we uncover the stories the world doesn't want you to hear. Because this isn't just news. This is Africa rising.